CSIS 2440 is filmed before a live studio audience.
All right, so the last thing we did was got the JavaScript and the CSS working, so now we have a nice looking form here that when we refresh it, this disables the drop-down so the user knows they have to pick one or the other, and everything else works as expected. So what I want to do now, remember we have this default file here, so they can click it and it just runs what's in the file, right? If we open up the text file, we can see all of those right there. Now what I want to do is when they add a palindrome themselves, rather than using the default, I want it to add to this list here, to this text file. Believe it or not, it's pretty easy. It's only a couple lines of code really, but there's a whole bunch of extra baggage that comes along for the ride, right? So let's just start here. Basically what's happening when where's our function here? Get the palindrome page content. This function is what delivers this content right here. It either shows this or it shows this blank form right here that we fill out, or it shows this, right? So that's what this one right here in line 9 does. Well, right here, if the button has not been pushed on this page, so let's go back there one more time. If this button right here has not been pushed, then we get our form right here. Okay, groovy. If the button has been pushed, then we're going to check to see did they choose the default, which is the checkbox, which means read the text file and display that. Otherwise, just let them enter the data and then process that, or process what they entered, I should say. So right here, this is them entering data, right? That inputs array is grabbing right out of the post. So we're going to grab that, and whatever that is, we're going to add it to the file, right? So we're just going to append it right on the back end of this file right here, starting right there. So let's just write a function. We'll just call it append to text file or something like that. And we'll actually pass it in that array right there. That's it. And then we need to, up here, create that function. Okay, so this function is going to take that input array, which is the post basically, and it's going to do the opposite of explode it, right? It's an array. We want to turn it into a string. So we're going to turn it into a string, and then we're just going to tack it onto the end of that file. Super easy. So you recall, right now, let's just start here. We just dump out that inputs array. It's just going to be a variable. So let's refresh, start over, 2, and let's get some new ones. I brought my book with me today. So here's a new one here, redivider. And we'll do rotator. Or on, I think it's on, what is it? Rotator's not a palindrome, is it? Yeah, it is. Yeah. So we'll do this, and now it's dumping out that var dump right there. It's just that array, right? Well, I can take that array, and I can say, we'll just call it string, is equal to implode. That's the opposite of exploding. And what I want to do is take the array, and the two parameters are, how do I want to delimit it? I want it to be separated by commas. So I'm going to add a comma and the inputs array. So what that will do is take that array and turn it into one long string with each element of the array separated by a comma. So if we just now echo that string out, you'll see, we refresh, right there is the string, redivider rotator, right? So we'll get rid of this var dump. And now all I really want to do is just add that to the file, right? I mean, that's really all there is to it. And the way we do that is very similar to what we did down here in the get the text file. So in fact, we can copy some of this right here. And we'll start off with the file name being the palindrome file. And we're going to open a file stream, but instead of being in read mode, we're going to be actually in append mode, right? We don't want to do write because that's going to overwrite everything. But append will put the cursor right there where my cursor is blinking at the end of Atom. Okay. So now we've got a file stream open. We've imploded this into a string. Now all I got to do is just do fwrite And we again pass in the file stream, and then we pass in the thing we want to write to it, input, or sorry, string. That makes sense? Now, one little problem here, that's going to tack it on right at the end without a comma, right? So we'll deal with that in a second, but let's just see how this plays out. So let's go back home, choose 2, and let's pick a new one here. I've got or torn rotor. That's a good one. Or torn rotor. Oh, that's not actually a palindrome. That's actually a mistake in this book. Yeah, that's not a palindrome. That's funny. He's got a mistake in his book. Okay, this one's a good one. Satire equals veritas. Satire equals veritas. Let's see if it catches our equal sign with our regular expression. So we'll click submit. And now, theoretically, if I go to that text file, look at that, it's reloading right there. It just asked me, hey, do you want to reload it? It's been changed. And sure enough, it added those pieces to it. Now, there's that comma thing we talked about, right? So let's fix that. Let's just clear that out. And that's easy enough. All we got to do is, right before the string, just tack on a comma. But what if the file starts empty? If the file's empty, we don't want the comma to be there, right? So we could just simply do something like this. Yeah, we could check the size of the file. So let's make another variable here called size, and it's equal to file size. Remember that one from the other day? Of the function or the file name. Okay, so if that's 0, we're not going to add a comma, but if it isn't 0, we will add a comma. So there's our string. Right here, we're going to say if size, if it's something other than 0, then we're going to say string equals comma string, right? So we're putting a comma right before that whole long string of things. Otherwise, we'll just leave it as is. So now we look here, if it's got something in it. So if we run this, enter 2, dog, let's just pick some in the drop down that's already there, and we'll do redivider. When I click submit, now when it reloads, there's a nice little comma there. And let's empty the file real quick. So there's nothing in it. Refresh it, and it should load it without adding the comma. Let's see. And it does. It doesn't put the comma there because of this little line of code right here in line 8. Okay, as far as writing to files, I mean, we're basically done, right? But that just opened up a whole can of worms that we don't realize. Okay, there's a whole bunch of stuff that can go wrong now. So we have to be prepared for this. Thing number 1, what if the file like it is right now is empty, all right? So let me just make sure it's actually empty. Let me empty it out. And I go here and I click the default. And then I go here and I click submit. We're going to get a whole bunch of errors because it's trying to read an empty file, right? Now there's lots of approaches we can take. We could just gray out the checkbox. You know, when we build the checkbox here on the first page, right there, we could just not put it there if there's nothing in that file. We could do that. We could just hide it or just not even echo it out at all or something. But I don't want to mess with that. I want to change it to where it checks to see if the file is empty. And if it is empty, then it says, hey, you're empty, so why don't you, there's nothing in there, so you have to enter at least one palindrome. Something like that, right? Okay. So we're going to use, to solve this problem, we're going to use our friend recursion. And all recursion is, when you get into 2420 and 1410, you'll learn a lot more about it, but recursion is a function that calls itself. Okay, that's all recursion is. So we're going to have our function call itself, and you'll see how we use that in just a minute. So here's what's going on. Basically, right here in the get palindrome content, remember, if the form has not been pushed, the one where they enter the, enter their palindromes has not been processed, then the form is displayed, or if they haven't done that. Otherwise, we look to see if they did the checkbox. Otherwise, we just grab their input. Okay. Well, right here, when we get the Palindrome text file, if that's empty, we got a problem. So let's first, in this function, check to see if it's empty, and if it is, then we're going to return false to right here. And then if it's false, we'll just do we'll figure out what to do next. But that's a good starting point, right? So go up to this Palindrome's text file, and right here, we're just going to kind of do this little trick here where we did the size thing, right? We're just going to check the size, and in fact, I'm going to replace this with the variable size because it's the same thing. But what I want to do is, if the size is 0, then I want to just simply return false, right? So right here, we're going to say if not size, right? Then return false. Otherwise, we're going to keep going. So let's just test that out. And right here, right there, append, no, not that one, sorry, this one, inputs, get that. And let's just say if not inputs, then echo error, file is empty or something like that. Else, we'll do this. That's a starting point. We just want to make sure it's actually capturing this, right? So again, all we did was in our thing where we're getting the text file, we see if it's empty right here. If it's empty, we're just going to return false instead of returning this exploded string into an array. So down here, if it's empty, then we're going to say there's an error. Otherwise, we're actually going to display the contents of that file. All right, so right now, it is empty. Let's put something in it just to make sure we didn't break anything. So we'll start there, home, and we're going to say to dog. We'll put some new stuff in there. And we already have something going. Okay, looks good. Let's see if it appended. Looks like it appended just fine. So now let's run the default. Default and dog, and this should display what's in that file. And it looks like it did. Okay. Everything's working the same. Now let's empty the file out again, though, and test it. Okay, so here we go. So we go home, we click default, and remember, it's empty right now. So it should give us the little thing that just says error. And it does. Error files empties. So this is good. Things are working the way we want. And again, just a little recap here. This function right here. If the form has not been processed, display it. Otherwise, see if they got the checkbox. And if they did, which is what we have in our case, then go ahead and get the file contents. If the file contents are empty, then give a little error. Otherwise, go ahead and process the file contents. Right? All right. And this little piece right here, or sorry, right here where we get the false, comes from up here where we just added this one extra line. If the file's 0, then return false. Okay. Here comes the recursion. You ready? What we want to do is, if it's empty, we don't want to just echo a message. We want to display the form. And that with a little message that says, the file is empty, please enter at least one palindrome. So we're going to recall this function right here, which is the one that we're actually in. Right here on line 38, down here, we're going to call the function we're in. And so we're going to pass back in these parameters, which we'll need to do. And so let's just start there. So if it's not, or if it's empty, then we're going to return this function. Okay, so we'll put this right here. And for the pal count, we're going to actually just pass in a hard number 1. Right? So so anywhere where this uses pal count, it's going to be replaced with just the number 1. It's not going to bother with the post or any of that. It's just going to use the number 1. Search word, we still have it because we're in the function. So we're just going to repass it back to ourselves. Like that. Okay? Then, because we're doing this, though, we're going to lose the post. Maybe. There's a possibility we'll lose the post. And I think we'll get an error right here on this. Let's just test this and see what happens. What I'm hoping will happen is it'll just display a form with one input in it, right? So come back home, use the default, which let me make sure it's actually empty. And it is, okay. And we're here, we click this, and we go here. And now we're getting an error, which is, yeah, okay, so I expected this. What's happening here, the post hasn't reset. So because it hasn't reset, it's still a little bit confused as to what to do. And so it's basically we just had sort of an infinite recursion here, right? Because the post had been processed already, so it didn't do that. The checkbox was checked, so it did this, which is calling this function again. So it just keeps going in a loop and keeps going, like, recursively calling itself over and over again. Okay, so what we're going to do, we can actually have a third variable right here that will have a default value. And so all the other places that are calling this function, it won't need the third parameter. But in this case, we're actually going to use the third parameter. So we're going to call this I don't know, what are we doing here? Reload or something like that. We're going to set it to false. So we're going to pass in true right here. So what's going to happen is we're going to call the function, pass in 1, pass in the search word, whatever it is, dog or whatever, and we're going to pass in this value true. And so that's going to go right here. That's going to replace that with true. The reason we're setting it this way, where we're saying reload equals false, is so that everywhere else in our code that calls this function, we aren't passing in a third parameter. Well, we can either go back and re-edit all those places that are calling it and force it to pass this parameter in, or we can just say if no parameter is passed in, then just set it to false, right? So it's a default. But now we have this. In our 23 if statement, we're going to say if reload is true, which is right here, or this is true, then show the form, right? So if reload or that whole thing. So now it should show the form. Okay, let's just test that, refresh it. And now we get unexpected something on line 20. That's probably a parenthesis issue. Oh no, a semicolon. I don't know why I put that there. Sorry, that was a typo. All right, refresh that. Okay, so we're getting there, right? We got this little submit thing is showing up, so it is trying to load the form. But this is the post error I told you we were going to get a minute ago. Pal count, undefined index pal count. Okay, that is right here, pal count. Okay, well, it's fine. All we got to do is just replace that with the actual pal count right here. We could have done that from the beginning, but we just decided to call it directly from the post. What's happening here, again, just so we're clear, if we didn't add this reload thing, right, with this not being set and this empty, then it displays the form. Well, default was not empty, right? And so the form was not being displayed. It was trying to run this. But we did lose the pal count in our post. Okay? So all we're going to do is just replace that with pal count, which is a variable we created right here. It's this variable right here being passed in. And you'll recall often in the past we would take pal count, set it equal to the post value, and then just stick it down here. Well, in this case it's being passed in and there's no reason to dip out into the post. Okay, so that should get rid of that error and that should get us about where we want. Yeah. So what, again, to be clear now, what we've just done, we have an empty text file. I go home, I try to use the default, but it's like, hey, you can't use the default because it's empty. Now we just need to give them a little message that says so. And so the message is simple. We already know that we're using this reload variable as true. And so right here at the very top, we can just go like this. If reload is true, then we'll just add on a little message here that says the default page is empty. Please enter a palindrome. Simple enough. This isn't really part of our error trapping or any of that stuff. But this now is being tacked on only in the event that runs, that the reload is true. So I refresh it, it should give us a nice little error message. There you go. So from the beginning, there we go. And it gives us that. Now if I put something in here, real quick, Bob, go home, click that, and it'll just use Bob and we should be good, right? Because there was something in the file. How do you feel about all that? It's kind of messy, right? Maybe there may not necessarily be a homework assignment that has this, but in the real world, you have to be able to look and see if the file is empty before you do anything and And if it's empty, you do one thing. If it's not empty, you do another thing. So this is a very common thing you'll have to be able to do. And this is, depending on the context of what program you're writing, will change how you would solve the problem. But this way works just fine. But now you get a little taste of recursion too, right? Where we're right here, think about what's happening. This is saying if the inputs is empty, which means if that file was empty, then I want to return whatever that is. Well, that's kind of weird, right? Well, what will that be? Well, let's see. It calls that, and now this is 1, this is dog or whatever the word they entered, and this is true. Okay, so since that's true, show the form. We show the form. Also, since that's true, we show this little error message, and then they add a word, Bob or whatever, and then they process the form. When they process the form, it recalls this function again. And this is now false because that's the default. Search word is still there. Pal count is still 1. And then this whole thing will be false. So it won't run this. It'll run this or this. Well, in this case, it's running this now because there is something in the post, right? So let's check to make sure that the rest of this works properly. So let's go back, empty that text file one last time, and make sure when they try to use the default, you must enter something. So let's enter something, make sure this works. And it does work, and it now should be in the text file, and it is. So it's all working. But there's one glaring issue. Can you see what it is? Remember I told you this opens up a big old can of worms, right? There's one more problem. What if I just refresh this page? What's going to happen? Or if just some person comes along and they decide to choose that as their palindrome, right? It's going to keep appending that file with the same thing over and over again. So we have duplication issue, right? Yeah. So the title of today's lecture is just writing to files. But the truth is, when you write to a file, there's a whole bunch of other things you got to consider, right? One is, what if the file's empty? Which we've dealt with that already now. And you'll have to solve that a million different ways depending on the context of what you're writing. The second thing now, what kind of file is it? Is it the kind of file where it doesn't matter if there's duplicates and we can just throw a bunch of stuff in there? Well, in our case, we're actually making a comma-separated list, and we don't want duplicates. Maybe duplicates are fine depending on your context, but in ours, it matters. So let's deal with that. Right here in the append to text, this is pretty simple code that writes to the text file, but we want to prevent it from writing if it's already in there. What we basically need to do is grab everything in the text file and then compare it to this thing right here that's been passed in, right? And I'm going to change that name to array. It doesn't matter what the variable is called, just call it X, right? But I just like that name better. So append to the text file. All right, we get passed in an array. I look inside the text file right here and see if it's got anything in it. And then I open up a file stream. And then I'll take that string, this variable that I just invented called string, and I'll implode this array and turn it into a string that's comma separated. All right, if there's something in that file, then I'm going to attack on a comma. If there's not anything on the file, we just go with this. We just take string as it is, and then either way, we write what's there into the file. Okay. Before I do any of that, I got to go through and check, is anything in here also inside of this file here? Right? But this is a little bit trickier than you might think. So what we want to do is we're going to loop through the array that we have here, and we're going to compare each element in this array to the array that holds this, right? So we basically need to get this text file content, because remember, what does this function do? It returns an array, right? Well, we might as well just call it right here and get the array ourselves right here and do something with it, okay? So we're going to say text file is equal to get the text file. So now we have an array right there, text file. That's an array that contains the 0th element is madam, I'm madam, the first element's madam, I'm madam, and the last element's madam, I'm madam. Put some different things in here. So right now, this text file, it will have those 3 elements in it, right? Does that make sense? So now what I want to do, this is an array. Well, there's a function in PHP called inArray, in_array. And so what I want is this array, which holds all of the palindromes that they entered into the input form, and I want to look at them one at a time and see if they are in that array, right? So we can loop through. We'll do a regular for loop because we're going to need to look at the index. Set that to 0. X is less than the size of the array that's being passed in, and we'll do x++. And this, again, remember, this is the stuff that the user entered into the fields, right? Okay, so in here, we're going to ask the question, and this might have worked with the for each loop, we'll see. If in array, and what we need, the needle in the haystack, right? The needle is this element, the element that we're on, right? So the xth element, if we're asking, is that in this array called text file? Make sense? So it's 2 parameters, right? All this is saying is this element inside of this array anywhere, right? So it looks through the whole array and just sees that this element's there. Well, if we do a loop, then it's going to get every single element of this and compare it to this array. That make sense? So what do we want to do if it's there? What do we want to do if it's not there, right? That's the idea. Right, don't add it to the file, right? So basically what we want to do is make a new array that holds only the non-duplicates, right? So if it's not in this array, if it's not in that text file array, then we're going to say new array, square brackets, equals that. Follow? So we're building a brand new array that only has in it the elements here that were not inside of here. And in fact, we could have done it with the for each loop. I was thinking we would need the index for some reason, but we do not. So maybe we'll change that in a minute. So now I have this new array here that's equal to this. Okay, that's a starting point. What we need to do now is we don't want to implode array. We want to implode new array. So we need to change that down here, right? To new array. But there's one other problem we're going to run into. Let's test this so far. We're going to get some errors, but that's okay. So far, what we've done, we've looped through the array that the user put 3 palindromes into the field or whatever. We're looping through it, and one at a time we're saying, hey, is that thing they put in inside of this other array, which is just the text file, right? Is this, if it is, then don't worry about it, but if it's not, then go ahead and add it to this new array. Now when we get down here, we're going to implode the new array. Okay, so let's start here. Madam, I'm Adam, Bob, see now felines. Those are what are already there. So let's put some duplicates here. We'll use 2, and we'll do Bob and Beavis. Beavis is not in our file. So it should add only Beavis, right? Because Bob's already in there. So let's see what we get. Okay, it tested them properly. Let's look and see. And it only added Beavis. Yay, right? What happens though if this is empty? Let's try that out. So we'll go here, we'll enter 2 palindromes, and Madam, I'm Adam. So if we see here, it says in array expects parameter 2 to be an array. Well, this is still loaded, right? But it didn't check for duplicates, okay? Which doesn't need to because there aren't any if it's empty. But what's happening here, this in array, it says that it's expecting parameter number 2 to be an array. Well, text file was not an array, it was empty, right? So before we even do this, we need to see if this text file was empty or not, which we already kind of are doing that here, right? So maybe we can just take this and we'll move it up here and we'll say, if there's something in the size, we'll do that. And that thing we were doing here with the size, if size. Let's see if we can combine this. We need to do that still. The problem is string doesn't exist yet. String is built here. That's a good point. That should be up here so we can get to it. That was a good catch. I had this below. That would have not worked. Line 6 is just getting the size of the file. If there's nothing in the file, this will be 0, or maybe false, but it'll be something that returns false. So we now say if size. If size means if it's not false or not 0, which means there's something in it. So if there's something in it, we have to check for duplicates, which is what's going on there, right? So even if the file is, in this case, has something in it, or it does not have something in it, we still have to implode what they entered in up here. Then we're going to check to see if, again, if the file is empty, and in that event, we're going to add this little comma here, okay? But there's another problem here, right? This works except for this one little thing. If the file is empty, then this does not run. If this does not run, the new array does not exist. If new array does not exist, when line 19 runs, we're going to get an error, right? So that's easy enough. We could just do else new array equals the original array, right? Because all this means was that it doesn't matter what they entered in, there's no duplicates inside the file itself, okay? And so now new array is just set to whatever they entered in. We don't have to worry about doing all this duplicate checking. And now this string is built just fine. It's now new array being imploded into a list that's separated by commas. And then ignoring line 25 for a minute, we're just going to take string and stick it at the end of the file. Line 25 just says, oh, if the file happens to be empty, stick a comma in there first. Now, we can prevent ourselves from calling that twice. I'll show you an idea I have, but I think this will do it. So let's go back here. Let's get this emptied out first. Actually, we'll leave that. We'll put those in there. And we'll start over, use the default, make sure that works, and it works. Dog, cat, madam, I'm Adam. Nothing got appended. Go back home. We enter 2, and let's go with noon, and something that's in the file, madam, I'm Adam. And that seems to be working, and it should add noon to the list, and it does. So everything's working now. Let's just test it when it's empty now. So here we go. 2 palindromes, dog, and we'll do madam and redivider. And now, before we click submit, it's going to check to see for duplicates, but the text file is empty. So because it's empty, this never gets run. Only this does. So new array is just going to simply become those 2 values, madam, I'm Adam, and redivider, and it's going to implode those 2 and turn into a string that's madam, I'm Adam, comma, redivider. And then it's going to check again to see if the file was empty, which we already know it is, but it's got to check it again and add a comma if it's not empty. Okay? And it won't add the comma. And so submit, that all worked. Text file, added those 2 things. So it's working. Pretty cool. Last thing though, there is a way to get around calling that if twice. Okay? Basically, if there is something in the file, then we'll have this file called comma equals 0 or equals nothing, right? Otherwise, comma equals a comma, right? Something like that. It's silly. But now, all we have to do instead of doing this, we can say comma concatenated onto that string right there, right? It's the same thing, but that way we're not calling the if twice. It's arguable which way is a better solution, but they both should work. Oh, $sign. What happened there? Don't know how that disappeared. All right, refresh. Home. And use the default, which should tell me to enter a palindrome. We haven't tested that for a while. Enter a palindrome. And it should have just added it to the file. And it did. Oh, the comma. So let's think about that one for a minute. Yeah, why did that get added there? Because the file was empty. Oh, if it's empty, we don't want to add the comma. I did that backwards. That's why. Sorry about that. That was my fault. Okay, so let's try that again. I'll show you the error though, that I just, another problem I just noticed, maybe we'll fix it. Go home, I click this, and then I forgot to put a word. Watch what happens when I forget to put a word. This gets ungrayed out. See that? We got to deal with that, but we'll look at that another time maybe. All right, madam, submit. There we go. Okay, let's try it again. We're going to go, I'll just refresh the page. It should not do anything to that text file because it's just madam again. And we get invalid argument implode on line 25. Added the comma. That's funny. Yeah, we don't want that either. But what's going on line 25? Oh, implode new array. Yeah, new array was empty. So here's what happened here. All right, I'm glad we did this. I forgot this was going to be an issue. So madam's the only thing there, right? Go home, and I'm going to put one palindrome, and I'm going to put madam. It's a duplicate, right? So this part runs because there is something in the file, but it finds a duplicate. So this new array ends up being empty. So when we get down here, we try to implode this new array. It's nothing. Follow? Right? So we're going to get the errors here, right? So all we got to do is not do this if new array is empty, right? Yeah, so if not new array, or sorry, if new array, then do that. And also that, right? So if there's something in the array, then go ahead and implode it, and then put the comma or not put the comma if needed. And then open up the file and write to it. We only want to do that if there's something in the array as well. So that doesn't even need to be there outside the if. And I think this will get us. All right, so here we go. Madam, get that comma out of there. Go home, choose one, choose madam. Got another issue here, but let's see. Undefined variable new array. We declare it, that'll solve the problem. So just new array equals an empty array, right? Just that's all we need to do. So now it's declared as a variable. So when we get down here, then it won't give me that issue. All right, let's go back. Make sure that this is nothing in here but the madam. And we put madam. And it should not have added anything, and it did not. Yay. So make sure everything else works. And we'll go madam and Beavis, and it should just add Beavis with a comma, and it did. What if they put this? Madam, I'm Adam, and they don't put any punctuations different than what's there, right? So look what happens. It added it. What we're just comparing is the raw input to what's actually in the file. But we can fix that very easily. If we come down here, in the palindrome function, these two lines here, we need to basically rerun those at the very top where we're doing our little checking. So instead of recopying this, let's just turn those two into a function. Right here, that's just called function clean word or something like that. And it takes in, it's just going to do that code right there. It takes in, word to clean, something like that, okay? And then this, we're going to call that function to clean the word. So we're just changing our palindrome slightly. Clean word phrase, right? That's going to do all the cleaning that we've already been doing, but now it's in a separate function. Well, the advantage of that is, let's fix our variables here real quick. All right, it's just going to change those. And it's going to return word to clean, right? So now this palindrome function works the same, but now phrase equals whatever clean word returns, right? And so it returns all of this stuff here. But now I can use this function up above, and on the in array is clean word, right? Is that in the text file? Now the other problem is though, so now I've cleaned the word to where it's all lowercase, no punctuation, right? But the text file still isn't that way, right? So I need to change the text file to also be all lowercase. Does that make sense? And all the punctuation out. But I don't want to actually alter the text file. So we're going to make a copy of the text file, right, in another array. Does that make sense? Right, the text file is being grabbed right here, and we're comparing each individual word that they entered. Madam, I'm Adam. We're cleaning it up, and so now it's all stripped down, no punctuation, it's all lowercase, and we're seeing if it's in the text file array. So what we're going to do here is we're going to grab this and loop through it and make a new array that replaces the contents of this text file variable. It doesn't replace the actual file itself. And we're going to clean up each word one at a time, right? So that's easy. We'll just do a for each here on the text file as clean text or something like whatever. And then we'll just simply say that we have a new array, so new text, right, whatever, is equal to clean word, clean text. And I don't like that. We're going to just say word. Too confusing. So we now, and we need to do it that way, it's an array. So we're just saying loop through the string, or sorry, the array here that came from this file. It's an array with those three things in it. Loop through it, and for each element, clean the word, clean it, and add it here. We're not changing the contents of this. We're not changing the contents of the actual file. We're just making a new array. Now we have a new array that is all of the words are cleaned. So now we just put that right here instead. Yeah, so what we're checking to see is the clean word, the cleaned up version of what they entered, does it match this new array that is the cleaned up versions of all the words? Right, so if we just quickly, right here we'll echo text file, and then down here, or sorry, that's a var dump, I apologize, var dump. So we var dump the text file, and then down here, we var dump the new text file, if you will. You'll see that we didn't change this. In fact, I'll even move this var dump to after we run the loop, just to prove the point, okay? We won't change that file. We will not change the contents of text file, and we will just be adding a new variable. So here we go. We refresh it. Just refresh. Actually, let's add a few here. 3. And let me make sure I don't have any duplicates. I don't want to deal with that yet. And let's get rid of this. Madam, I'm Adam and Beavis. Okay, so over here, and we'll change that to redivider and Bob and Madam. Okay. So here is the file, the actual file as it stands right now, what's going to be appended now when I open it up, right? But before I let it append, it's just Madam, I'm Adam and Beavis, right? That's the var dump right there. Then over here, it's a copy of it, but it's been cleaned up to where it's Madam, I'm Adam, no punctuation, nothing. And then Beavis, which didn't change. But Madam, I'm Adam changed. So now this is a new array that we're looking at, and we're comparing each element that the user entered here, right? We're comparing each of those with this new cleaned up version to see if it's in there. That way we're guaranteed that if it's a duplicate, it will find it, right? It gets rid of all worries about case sensitivity, punctuation, and everything like that. So we'll get rid of that, and that's it. Any questions about it? There's a lot of stuff, and it was more of a hodgepodge, but the idea was meant to show you once you start writing to a file or reading from a file, you open a whole hornet's nest of stuff, right? That was the point. So I know it was a little scattered, but that was the reason we did it that way. Any questions?